So welcome everyone to this Transatlantic Currents webinar on political and social polarization in the US. My name is Lindén, and I'm a research fellow at the Center on US Politics and Power at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. And I will shortly hand the virtual mic to our non-resident fellow, Leo Michel. But before I do so, I would like to thank the Erkko Foundation for their pivotal role in the founding of our center and for their support for our current activities, such as this webinar. And as you listen to the webinar, please feel free to type in questions and comments using the chat function. I will later read them out loud and give our guest speaker an opportunity to answer some of them. And next up, our non-resident fellow, Leo Michel, who is also a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council, a decades-long career in the US government Distinguished Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies, Director for NATO Policy, Director for Non-Nuclear Arms Control at OSD and Pentagon. And he's got degrees from Johns Hopkins and Princeton University. And our guest speaker today is Eleanor Klibanoff. She's the women's health reporter for the Texas Tribune and based in Austin. And in the Tribune, she has covered abortion, maternal health care, gender-based violence, and LGBTQ issues, among other topics. And previously, she worked for the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting in Louisville, where she reported, produced, and hosted the podcast Dig, which was nominated for the prestigious Peabody Award in 2022. But without further ado, take it away, Leo.
Thanks very much. Good morning, Maria. Hello from Washington, and welcome to this episode of Transatlantic Currents. It's virtually impossible these days to read or listen to a discussion of American institutions, politics, or major socioeconomic and cultural issues that does not warn in some way that the country has become more and more dangerously polarized. Now, to be sure, polarization is not a new phenomenon in the United States. In the mid-1960s, when I was a university student, the nation was deeply divided by an unpopular war in Southeast Asia, 3 major political assassinations, and hard-fought battles, sometimes violently in the streets, to ensure the civil rights of all its citizens. Since then, respected researchers and public opinion experts have traced a more or less steady decline in the public's view of governmental and political institutions. In fact, a recent report, which we will post the link online shortly on the chat function, but this report by the nonpartisan Pew Research Center, appropriately titled Americans' Dismal Views of the Nation's Politics, found the positive views of many of those institutions are at historic lows. For example, only 16% of adults say they trust the federal government all or most of the time. And more Americans have an unfavorable than favorable opinion of the Supreme Court, the first time this has occurred in polling since the late 1980s. The effects of polarization at the federal level are now obvious to all. There's constant gridlock over congressional action on things like budgets, immigration policy, the environment, continued assistance to Ukraine and Israel, to cite just a few examples. Meanwhile, a string of Supreme Court decisions in recent years on abortion, guns, voting rights, and various forms of discrimination have reversed long-standing precedents. Now, many of those decisions reflect the court's ideological shift to the right, thanks to the appointment of 3 very conservative justices during the Trump presidency. But as noted by the Washington Post, the conservative strict interpretation of the Constitution as it was written in the 18th century appears fundamentally out of step with the majority of the public who believe the Constitution needs to be adaptable to changing times, changing perspectives, and conditions. Why does this matter? Put simply, severe polarization could cripple the institutions that are vital for a functioning democracy, including the fair conduct of elections, effective legislation, and judicial checks on executive powers, and respect for the informal but crucial norms of tolerance and good faith efforts to find consensus for the greater good of the American public. All of these will be under strain in the run-up to next November's general elections. And I want to remind you that in addition to the race for the White House, which is likely, but not yet certain, to be a rematch between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, at stake will be all 435 seats in the House of Representatives, 1/3 of the 100-member Senate, 11 of 50 governorships, and some 85 state legislative chambers across 44 states. So it's important to understand how and why polarization has taken hold at the state and local level, not just in Washington. And we hope to use this Transatlantic Currents series in the coming months to offer you some interesting snapshots of the US political scene outside the Capitol. And today we're going to look at Texas with Texas Tribune reporter Eleanor Klibanoff. Now, why Texas? Well, Texas has the second largest population of the 50 states, about 31 million residents, or nearly 10% of the total US population, compared with California's 39 million. Texas is also the second largest in terms of area, behind Alaska. It's slightly larger, in fact, than France and Switzerland combined. Moreover, Texas is a red state. The Republican Party has pretty much dominated the governorship and bicameral legislature since the 1990s, and according to a 2020 study of voting and partisanship in the US Congress, the Texas delegation ranked near the bottom, in fact, in 47th place out of 50 states in terms of support for bipartisan legislation. Eleanor, I want to discuss some specific issues with you, but before that, is there something that's special or even unique about Texas and Texans that helps us understand the political culture of what's called the Lone Star State?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I'm eager to have this conversation. And I think Texas is the right place to start this conversation because it is, as you said, I mean, it's so big and it's so nationally relevant for so many reasons. Texas is sort of on the front lines of many of these sort of most conservative political fights. Part of Texas's sort of mythology, or what makes Texas unique, is that it is the only state that was its own country before it joined the United States. So Texas was historically part of Mexico first, then went and became independent for about a decade, and then eventually was admitted to the United States as its own state, which has sort of given Texas let's say, outsized view of its own importance to the United States. And sort of, in part because it shares that border with Mexico, it shares the longest piece of the border with Mexico of any state in the United States. It is quite literally on the front lines of many of the biggest issues facing the US, especially immigration. As you mentioned, Texas has been under essentially single-party rule for over 2 decades. The Republican Party has dominated all statewide positions, as well as the state legislature, more so than more consistently than almost any other state, which has yielded has shifted the political conversation pretty far to the right, that, very few people in state government fear a Democratic challenger, a challenger from the left. Their fear is a challenger from the right, so they are all sort of pushed to be more conservative, more conservative, more conservative. And Texas has become a real sort of laboratory for the most conservative ideas passing through state government. As Maria noted, I used to work in Kentucky, and my joke when I moved to Texas was that I, was tired of waiting 2 years for the ideas to show up in Kentucky. So I came to Texas, where they're born. And that has been the case. I mean, Texas is on the front lines of, I guess you might say, like conservative innovation on so many issues.
Mm-hmm. So let's turn to a few of those specific issues now. And actually, I'd like to begin with abortion rights. A few seconds of the background here. In September 2021, as I understand it, the Texas legislature approved what was called Senate Bill 8. People refer to it simply as SB 8, that banned most abortions at about 6 weeks after conception, which is before many women even know that they are pregnant. This action took place nearly 1 year before the US Supreme Court reversed its historic decision in 1973 that the US Constitution generally protected a right to have an abortion. How did Texas become one of the earliest and one of the most important battlegrounds over the abortion issue? And did SB 8 actually enjoy broad public support?
Right. This was sort of I think, an interesting wrinkle in the abortion story that has gotten a little bit ignored since the Dobbs decision in June 2022 that overturned Roe v. Wade, which obviously was, a historic Supreme Court decision, reversing, as you said, 50 years of precedent. But a year before that, as you noted, Texas found a loophole. And conservative states have spent most of the last 20 years working through their state legislatures to try to find ways to ban or more commonly limit abortion sort of within the confines of what the Supreme Court would allow. And it seemed like basically every year Texas would pass a law that tried to limit abortion access. It would go all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court would knock it down and say, we've been very clear about this. The US Constitution protects abortion access. And this became just like a sort of very common up and down legal proceeding, with Texas sort of willingly trying new and more innovative ways to ban abortion. They, in 2021, knowing that Roe v. Wade was on, shakier ground than ever and was on the precipice likely of being overturned, Texas tried, the most novel approach yet to banning abortion, which was to say that abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy are prohibited, and that law would only be enforced through private lawsuits. So no state officials are tasked with enforcing the law, which had previously been sort of the sticking point for the Supreme Court. This says, if I know that you performed an illegal abortion, I, as a private citizen, can sue you for up to $10,000. And so can everyone else on this call, assuming they were in the US. I don't have to know the person you performed the abortion on. I don't have to have been there. I don't have to have been harmed by this at all. I just get $10,000 from you. And the law survived Supreme Court challenge. Abortion clinics across the state, fearing sort of this onslaught of lawsuits, stopped performing abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. And it accomplished what it set out to do, which was effectively banning abortion and serving as a sort of early indicator. I think when the Supreme Court allowed that law to stand, despite saying, all the justices, even the conservative justices, seemed very concerned by this loophole, by this, sort of sidestepping of their previous precedent. They also said they didn't really see a way to knock it down. And so the law remained in effect. And I think that was the early sign for many that Roe v. Wade was going to be overturned. And once again, Texas sort of was out on the front lines of that. And it didn't, to your last question, SB 8 was not popular. People were not on board with this. It, I think, sent shockwaves across the country. Abortion enjoys largely popular support in Texas, despite what our lawmakers, how our lawmakers legislate the issue. But it it created pandemonium. I mean, abortion clinics in Oklahoma and New Mexico were inundated with Texans. It sort of was an early indicator of what we're now living with, which is a complete abortion ban in Texas.
Mm-hmm. So what could you say a little bit now about the practical effect on women's access to abortion and even broader healthcare services in Texas and their ability to leave the state for abortion access? Is it true, for example, as I've read, that some local governments in Texas want to prohibit travel through their jurisdiction so that women seeking abortions in another state cannot do so?
Yes, and we should say, as you alluded to this earlier, but Texas, is huge. Texas has 10% of the women of reproductive age in the country. So Texas banning abortion, Texas is one of about 13 states that have banned abortion. And those states are not, evenly distributed throughout the country. So they tend to be in the Southeast. They are largely connected to each other. We have wide swaths of this country now where abortion is banned, but Texas is the big one. It takes 12 hours to drive east to west across Texas. And so women who, for example, live on the eastern side of the state, they are to the east surrounded by states that have banned abortion. The closest abortion clinic is often a 10+ hour drive away, which is, simply just prohibitive for many people, particularly women who, we know that the people who have abortions tend to already have children. They tend to be poorer than, the average woman. They tend to be, facing significant limitations into their ability to suddenly leave the state quickly. So while many women are traveling out of state, they are getting appointments in New Mexico, Kansas, Illinois. Many others are not. They're simply carrying those pregnancies to term. And Texas is sort of aware that there is likely a baby boom coming. I don't know if I would say that they are preparing for it, but Texas already was facing a significant shortage of obstetricians and gynecologists. We have a significant shortage of primary care physicians. We are seeing already fewer doctors. Anecdotally, we're seeing doctors say that they are leaving the state because of this. There are early indications that fewer medical students are coming to Texas and staying for their residency programs. So the long-term repercussions of this are going to be significant, especially if, as you indicated, we're seeing the state continue to try to go after people who are seeking abortions, or the clinics are closed, right? The state is no longer focusing its energy on going after abortion clinics. They have left the state. All of Texas's abortion laws have an exception that say, we won't prosecute the woman who got the abortion. But they are sort of closing all the doors around that woman to say, we will try to find ways to prosecute anyone who helps you. We will try to prosecute anyone who is aware of your plans, anyone who assists you in any way. And one of the, I think, most shocking attempts so far is these local ordinances that say, if we find out that you drove someone through our county on the way to out of state to get an abortion, we will pursue you through private lawsuits. And that, it's starting very, very small. We just have a couple small counties, and recently one slightly larger rural county that has passed this. It has not been tested in court, but it's a significant departure from long-standing federal law and federal protection for interstate travel. I think the idea is that if this got to the courts, it's unlikely to survive. But in the meantime, it is having the effect of scaring women, scaring the friends and family of women who might support them, and just creating sort of fear and confusion, which is largely, in many cases, the effect of a lot of these laws, is just to have a woman who might think about trying to drive to New Mexico or think about asking her sister to drive her to New Mexico say, I don't know what the status of that law is. It's too scary to try. I just won't.
Well, I'll just point out to those in the audience, and you can go on the link that we've provided in the invitation to Eleanor's work, that she's written some very gripping stories about some of the women who are now speaking out publicly about the physical and psychological trauma that they've suffered due to their inability to receive timely medical attention for complicated pregnancies. But in the interest of time, I want to turn to a second issue, which has an important dimension in Texas. It's the issue of gun violence. Texas has been the scene of 9, I believe, mass shootings over the last 14 years. One of the most shocking occurred in May of 2022, when 19 children and 2 adults were murdered in an elementary school in the town of Uvalde. Their attacker, an 18-year-old, armed with an assault-type weapon. Yet, according to a Texas Tribune study earlier this year, the state's Republican-controlled legislature has actually expanded over the years where guns are allowed to be carried, who can have a firearm in schools, and the right to openly carry guns in public. Even a modest proposal to raise the legal age to purchase a firearm from 18 to 21 years seems to have been stalled or perhaps even defeated. So, Eleanor, what's the explanation for this, given that various polls, even in Texas, show support for some reasonable measures to make gun control laws more strict and more equitable?
Right. I think there was a lot of hope after the Uvalde shooting that, this might be the time that Texas passes some common sense gun measures, as advocates call them. And, no one is asking, no one on either side of this issue is asking for some sort of wholesale, shifting of the gun laws that says, no one can have a gun or anything like that, which is sort of the fear rhetoric that we hear from the right is, they want to take your guns. And that's pretty far from what we're talking about. We're talking about this very narrow, let's shift certain gun laws in certain ways that, research has indicated will protect the rights of legal gun owners while also, preventing these sort of, horrific mass shootings. But a lot of research has shown over the years that after a mass shooting like the one we saw in Uvalde, Republican state legislatures in the United States tend to loosen gun laws, which is counterintuitive, I think, for most people. But the idea is that conservatives tend to believe or, tend to profess that the answer to preventing gun violence is more guns, that the way to keep us safe is by making sure that, if there are mass shootings in schools, give teachers guns. If there's mass shootings in theaters, give theater employees guns. If there, and there several years ago here in Sutherland Springs, there was a mass shooting at a church, and a man showed up, and he was sort of the proverbial good guy with a gun that we talk about, and he killed the shooter. And that has become sort of an example for conservatives of, the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Which, if that is your mindset, and if you believe, as many conservatives in Texas do, that you have a constitutional right to sort of unfettered gun access, then it would follow to logic that after a mass shooting, you would try to get more guns in more hands. Now, a lot of research has proven that the answer does not lie in more guns, but that sort of became, even these common sense, as they call them, gun proposals, for example, raising the age to buy assault-style weapons, fail because it's become sort of this, not a question of what does the research say about gun ownership, but what do I believe is my right? And it historically has been described as a constitutional right. So in Texas, we have what conservatives call constitutional carry, which means permitless gun carrying, which it's framed that way by conservatives to indicate, I have a constitutional right to carry a gun without a permit. The state should not have a way of sort of measuring or limiting that right. It has now really transitioned in many circles from constitutional carry to a God-given right to carry guns, and it's become really part of the religious and political ethos that is slowly taking over this state of, I have a right to a gun, not because you say I do as the US government, but because I have a right to defend myself as given to me by God, which is a pretty hard thing, I think, to sort of unravel, even in the wake of a mass shooting like this one, and get people to sort of say the state has a right to limit gun access, even in, as you said, like, moderate ways.
Mm-hmm. And even the emotional pleas, for example, of the parents of the children that were slaughtered, really. In Uvalde, this doesn't seem to move the needle in a way that it may affect somewhat public opinion, but it doesn't seem to affect the state legislature or the governor at all, who seem not to want to talk about guns. They want to talk about mental health and other things, but not about the problem of too many guns in irresponsible hands.
Right. And I think, we sort of talk around this issue, right? We talk about mental health. We talk about, I think a great example, we just talked about abortion. Texas has very high rates of maternal mortality. So like women dying during pregnancy, childbirth, or the first year after childbirth. And Texas has actually dedicated a lot of energy to this issue and some funding to this issue to try to, help women not die from hemorrhage, women not die from preeclampsia, women not die, from not being able to get medical care after childbirth. But a large portion of women who are dying from what we call maternal mortality are dying from intimate partner violence. Their partners are killing them. It's a very dangerous time to be in a violent relationship. And researchers across the board agree that the answer to dealing with that, for example, would be limiting guns. I mean, the best way to protect a woman in a violent situation is limiting access to guns. And so while Texas will deal with all the other aspects of maternal mortality, that has sort of become the third rail is, we're not going to talk about guns. And so until we talk about that, it sort of becomes hard to address the issue of, women dying from that one, type of maternal mortality. So it's on a lot of issues. Texas will talk about every aspect of a problem as long as it doesn't touch guns.
So just a couple more questions. We do want to leave time for our audience that's submitting things through the chat. So about half, you mentioned this, about half of the US-Mexican border, which runs along 4 states, but about half of that entire border runs through Texas. So it's not surprising that immigration enforcement questions would be a major issue in the state. This past September, for example, according to figures I've seen, around 5,000 migrants per day, mostly non-Mexicans, by the way, were apprehended in South, Mid, and West Texas by the US Border Patrol. The thing with Texas is that immigration law and border enforcement has long been considered an area subject to federal, not state jurisdiction, but in recent years, and particularly since the beginning of the Biden administration, the Republican governor and legislature have taken steps to implement their own border security programs. Could you briefly describe what's happening here and the kind of court confrontations now that we're seeing between the Biden administration at the federal level and the state law and actions?
Yes, it's a really interesting issue because it is one of the few issues, I think, that Democrats and Republicans agree on, that there is a crisis at the southern border, that, our current immigration systems are not working. As you noted, I mean, we're seeing this deluge of migrants from many countries, and not just from Central and South America, but, from the Middle East, from Africa, from, all over, coming through the southern border. And there's no good plan right now for handling that. Where the two parties disagree is on how to handle that. And the Biden administration reversed many Trump era policies, and Texas sort of from day one of the Biden administration said anything you do to loosen immigration sort of limitations, we will see you in court. We will challenge that in court. And that has been the case. I mean, Texas, 10 days after Joe Biden took office, got a court order to block one of his programs and one of his policies. And a big piece of, and we can talk about what Texas has done to sort of take this into their own hands, but I will also say that a big part of Texas's confidence in the courts is that during the Trump administration, President Trump appointed more federal judges than almost any other president in U.S. history, with like only one other exception, and has fundamentally shifted the balance of the federal courts in Texas and in other red states where he appointed a lot of judges. And what that means is that Texas has very good odds now when it files, even though it's filing these lawsuits in federal court, they know which judges to go to, which federal judges to go to. They go to that judge, these conservative judges who were appointed by President Trump, and in this case, several anti-immigration judges or judges who have ruled historically against, immigration issues. They go to that judge, and that judge has the ability to grant a nationwide injunction. So one judge in Texas can block a Biden policy for the entire nation. And then it goes to an appeals court that also became much more conservative under Trump and generally has been upheld, and then goes to the U.S. Supreme Court, which, as we talked about, has become much more conservative. So Texas sort of has this pipeline through the courts, almost entirely thanks to President Trump, that has allowed them to basically bat down anything the Biden administration tries on immigration, which has fundamentally changed like how policies proceed. Is just anything the Biden administration tries immediately gets blocked in Texas for the whole country, which then allows the Biden administration to say, allows Texas to say the Biden administration isn't doing anything. And then they have stepped in and just in the last few years now, and implemented their own programs, really wrested a lot of this historically federal issues, and put it back onto Texas. They've created their own sort of National Guard units. They have private citizens arresting migrants. They're trying to build their own border wall. It's become a really fluid situation in Texas, thanks to this intervention through the courts.
You mentioned Donald Trump, and this will be my final question. And I know that you're not a pollster, but I have to ask the question. In the 2016 and 2020 elections, Trump's share of the Texas vote was about the same, a little bit more than 52%. Biden outperformed Clinton by about 3 percentage points. So there was a slight increase in support of the Democratic candidate between 2016 and 2020. But given everything that's happened since November 2020, we had the January 6th insurrection, and a lot is known now about Trump's role in that. You've had the several criminal indictments of the former president, something that, of course, is unheard of in American history. And you have increasingly extreme rhetoric, including, for example, on what he plans to do in mass deportations and setting up detention camps and so forth if he's reelected in 2024. I'm not asking you to predict the next election, but have you seen anything, just looking at the Texas scene writ large, that would make you think that these changed circumstances since November 2020 would actually hurt the former president if indeed he's the Republican candidate, or actually would many of these things help his score?
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, of course, it remains to be seen. I do think Trump enjoys very strong support in Texas of the Republican field right now. And so I think that's, I'm certain he will be Texas's candidate or Texas's vote in the Republican primary. If it becomes, Trump versus Biden, as you said, which is sort of what most people are anticipating at this point, I do think the federal races, like the presidential race, are areas where we may see more of a shift than, in Texas, the local races, the state races tend to be more partisan. I think the question in all reality is probably less about indictments and rhetoric and these sort of individual candidate level things, which will have an impact. But also, how outraged are people about abortion? How outraged are they about Uvalde? How outraged are they about, and how well do they understand, and how strong of a case do Democrats make for the idea that, a vote for a Democrat, a vote for Biden is a vote against this like sort of Republican juggernaut in Texas. And if you're not happy with what the state legislature is doing, if you're not happy with what the governor's doing, and you feel like your vote isn't really making a difference on that level, well, you can make a difference on the federal level, right? Vote for a president that better reflects your values more so than maybe your state does right now. And I think if Democrats can make that pitch, that could be potentially successful, at least maybe to shift, if not to win Texas for the Democrats, at least to shift it more purple. Democrats have, I think, not always done enough to sort of put Texas in play, despite the fact that, it is, it's a young state, it's a diverse state, it is should be much more in play, I think, than it historically has been. It's just a question of whether or not this is the election that sort of catches fire in that way.
Okay. Thank you so much, Eleanor. And let me pass this back to Maria, who's been collecting questions from our webinar audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So far, we have one question. So I thought, while others are finding the courage to ask their questions, I thought I'd abuse my status as the moderator and ask the first question. I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the situation regarding transgender children in Texas, because about a little over a year ago, Texas Governor Greg Abbott seemed to be really going after these families. He ordered state officials to investigate families, and there was fear, at least, that children could be placed in foster care simply because their parents were doing what I think all of us here in this virtual room consider to be a positive thing, and trying to help their transgender child by affirming their identity and find ways to help the child figure out who they are. So this has been something that's been really shocking to follow. So I'm sure you have much more updated information on what's going on with that.
That was, really, I think, a pretty shocking step from the governor. I think across the board, advocates, legal experts, a lot of sort of national groups condemned that from the governor. And so by way of background, about 18 months ago, the governor issued this sort of, it has now sort of been undermined by the courts as a directive, but it's largely called a directive, to the state's child welfare agency, saying that they should investigate any parents who provide gender-affirming care to their minor children. And in the end, more than a dozen families were investigated. No children were removed from the home, and eventually a court blocked those investigations and basically put them on hold. But it was a pretty shocking weaponization of the child welfare system. Texas, by way of context, our child welfare system, our foster care system, is in horrible state. I mean, are under, for more than a decade, the state has been under court order to improve its system for dealing with children who are facing abuse and neglect. And there's certainly basically no progress being made. So the idea of taking children who are in a home that, by all metrics, from talking to these child welfare workers who investigated these families, these children were not being neglected. There was food in the fridge. Their parents were, working with their doctors to provide what they believed to be medically necessary care for their children. To have those children put into the foster care system, I think, was sort of a shocking and unexpected use of that system. A court has put that whole system on hold, and in all likelihood, the sense is that the governor has a bit given up on that. That it's facing so much backlash and it's so legally messy that they have found other ways, which is to go through the legislature and attempt to ban gender affirming care for minors, which basically says, anyone who gets hormone therapy, anyone who takes puberty blockers under the age of 18, a doctor performing that, would be illegal. And they are working on, as part of that, sort of weaning these teens off of their medical care. I mean, they were already receiving this medical care. It is now, been banned. There's an ongoing court challenge to that as well in Texas, as in many other states that have tried to do this. But we've heard, and the Tribune has written a lot of stories about families that have just decided to leave Texas because even with this even with the ongoing court battle, it's just too risky for them to keep their children here, and the doctors who perform this care are leaving.
Yeah, and I'm sure it's so stressful for the child. These are vulnerable children to begin with, and to live with that kind of fear that the society around them doesn't accept pretty much anything regarding their well-being is so such a huge stressor for the family.
Yeah, I'll say one thing about that was interesting to me is for many years, a lot of these families were very outspoken advocates. They would come to the state capitol, they would testify to lawmakers, they would protest any sort of limitations on LGBT rights. One of these families sort of famously invited the state attorney general over for dinner to sort of say, meet our family, meet our child, see, like, we're just like your family, we're just like your children. And that ended up sort of putting them in the spotlight and in the target when eventually the state really started targeting these families. And so it's had this sort of quelling effect as well, just on how comfortable and safe people feel exercising, in the US, their First Amendment rights to speak out, if that's maybe going to put them on a list of families to be investigated.
Yeah. Now we have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one, I guess, is hoping you could talk a little bit about the climate change debate in Texas, how that's playing out.
That's another thing that makes Texas really unique and really on the front lines of these issues. I mean, Texas is an oil and gas producing state. So Texas's economy is tied so strongly to fossil fuels, and that has made Texas very resistant to sort of facing the climate change question. And it has also given Texas, they would argue, standing in the courts to challenge basically any efforts from the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to enact, any limitations on how oil and gas is produced, on whether, encouraging companies to use renewable resources, things like that. And so Texas, similar to immigration, similar to abortion, has really staked its claim and put itself out there as, on the front lines of pushing back against any efforts to sort of protect the environment or reverse climate change.
Yeah. There's also a question here about the influence of the NRA on or other gun rights organizations, whether you think it has waned at all and how much they matter in Texas specifically.
It's a good question. And there are other reporters who have been studying the NRA and reporting on the NRA and its influence much better than I have. But my sense is that some of its influence has waned a bit, just since they've, several years ago had a string of scandals, and especially after the Parkland shooting, a mass shooting at a high school at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Florida. That was sort of, I think, the high point. That was maybe 2018. I can't remember now, but that was sort of the high point of attention on the NRA and I sort of identifying the NRA as the National Rifle Association as the problem and like sort of the barrier to change. And as a result of that attention, we got, a lot more reporting on their scandals, their use of money, their, how they have influenced the political process. And I do think since then, that influence has waned a bit. They've had a lot of like infighting in the institution as well. But it's still sort of the systems they've put into place remain extremely influential. And these lawmakers sort of put so much stake in having a sort of spotless record on gun control so that they will vote no on anything, that it's less about reviewing the merits of each bill and more about saying, I have always voted against gun control. I've always voted against any efforts to rein in the rights of gun owners. So I think that's not going away. And the funding that flows to that issue is certainly not going away.
Thank you. Now we have a question also about whether or not this kind of serious polarization could happen anywhere. Do you think that is mainly related to Texas, the viewer asks, or is this something that can happen everywhere and anywhere? And what would be the first or main signals to look for to avoid polarization from escalating? And how could we fight political and social polarization in Finland?
I can tackle the first part of that, which is to say, this is not unique to Texas. And I think Texas is an example of something that's happening in the entire United States. And certainly, we're certainly seeing examples of this in Europe and across the globe. I think the US is in like a very perilous moment right now where, and abortion is a good example of this. I hear so frequently, that this is creating basically two Americas, right? Do you want to live in an America where you can get an abortion, where your child can get gender affirming care, where, guns are restricted? Generally speaking, those states have, higher taxation, there's more investment in social services, things like that. Or do you want to live in a state where, your freedoms are protected more, and we're taking steps to protect, what they would call, unborn children, and we are valuing parents' rights, which is sort of the term that conservatives use for sort of educational access. And are we investing more fully in the privatization of services? And I hear frequently the idea that, if you don't like what Texas is doing, you can leave, right? Go to California then, vote with your feet, which first of all ignores like a large portion of the population that can't afford to do that and just sort of lives where they live because that's where they live. But even taking the people who might do that, that is how you increase polarization, right? I mean, you should have conservatives move to Texas and liberals move to California, and that is not a recipe for sort of a unified nation that I think has been the underpinnings of the American democracy for so long. So Texas is one example of this, but this is happening in all the states in different ways, even if the message is just, if you don't like what we're doing in California, go to Texas. It also, this is happening with all of these issues. These states are passing very similar looking laws in conservative states. Liberal states are taking, an active role against that. They're passing laws in the other direction. We're drawing lines like not that different from what led to the Civil War in the United States. Now that war was about slavery, but but that is sort of what the abortion map looks like in certain ways. And so there's nothing that happens in Texas that doesn't affect the rest of the nation in really huge ways. And as this, I think sort of the premise of this, there's nothing that happens in the United States that doesn't affect, the rest of the world in some ways. So it certainly is not limited just to Texas.
Thank you. We have one more question. It's a bit long, but I think to sum it up, it's it's confusing to many of us viewing this from the outside, how on one hand, conservative states like Texas are all about these individual freedoms, and freedom is such an American ethos, especially on the conservative side. And yet these limits on abortion, limits on transgender kids' access to care, these are all infringing on personal, very, very personal, intimate freedoms. So how do the Texan conservatives reconcile this ethos for freedom that they still proclaim to believe in with all these political steps in the culture wars where they actually take the side of limiting all these freedoms?
It's a great question. And it's sort of, I think, I mean, by and large, right, political ideology is not always consistent, right? I mean, they are advancing an agenda that I think would look very unfamiliar to, Republicans or conservatives of 100 years ago in the United States. But it's an interesting, Texas's constitution, the state constitution, is one of the only state constitutions that explicitly protects parents' rights. And so all these states, conservative states, in the last legislative session banned gender affirming care for minors, right? Said, doctors can't provide this, parents cannot authorize this for their teenagers. And many states, these the ACLU and Lambda Legal and these pro-LGBT legal law firms are challenging many of those bans in federal court. But in Texas, they're challenging it in state court because the state constitution explicitly protects parents' rights. And their argument is, as a parent, you have a right that Texas guarantees your right to provide and consent to medical care for your minor. Like, the state cannot infringe upon that. That is your constitutional right, which is a very interesting sort of coming back. It's a full circle argument to say, the state has gone too far. The state is trying to enact its political ideology around trans people or LGBT issues. They have, in fact, infringed upon one of these rights that is so inherent to Texas, which is the right of a parent. That case is still moving through the courts. That remains to be seen whether, the Texas courts will be amenable to that argument. But I think it's a very powerful political argument if Democrats sort of were able to harness that. We are, in fact, the party of freedom. We are saying, you have a right to bodily autonomy. You have a right to give your child the medical care they want. I think the guns is a little bit more complicated. I mean, there's a pretty strong freedom argument on the guns is, do whatever you want, have a gun, that's not our business. But on these other issues, I mean, conservatives in Texas would say, protecting an unborn child, protecting, a baby from abortion is a higher calling. They are sort of saying, we're willing to bend our rules around, complete freedom for that and sort of live with that inconsistency. But I think on a lot of these issues, it gets a lot mushier. Texas this year has attempted to ban, to rein in, whether or not drag queens can perform and where they can perform, and whether or not minors can be there. And that faced some degree of pushback from, from some conservatives who basically said, leave people alone. Like, if people want to, perform in drag, let them. Like, what are we engaging in this for at all? How is this our issue? And so I do think we're starting to see a little bit of pushback at the margins there.
Yeah, and even on the gun issue, the thing you mentioned about how mothers and presumably also babies are at risk if the violent father has a gun, that's also something where if children's rights are so important that then the freedom arguments can be bended, then again, there's kind of hypocrisy there, I think. That it can't be bended on the gun issue, but it can be bended when it comes to infringing on women's right to health care. Somebody's saying in the chat, I wonder if it's considered legitimate to defend constitutional parents' rights to buy a gun, but I'm not quite sure what this is referring to. Because yes, the parents would have a right to buy a gun just like anybody else.
Right. I mean, this is like, I think it all gets very fuzzy, and I don't think it's been a consistent ideology. I mean, I think a good example of this is, Texas broadly would prefer the federal government butt out entirely and just let Texas do what Texas wants.
Yeah.
But when it comes to immigration, they say, the federal government needs to do more. The federal government should be, acting well beyond what the courts have previously said is within their right. So, they have a political agenda frequently, and enforcing that, I think, often trumps sort of sticking to a consistent vision of the world.
Yeah, there's a comment now in the chat thanking you for these interesting topics, both of you, these interesting topics and reflections, and greetings to our US friends from the Arctic Circle. But the viewer wanted to let us know that he is very keenly following the presidential elections and all US politics related. I had one more topic of interest in mind, and that's regarding, I think it was last year, the Texas Republican Party had this initiative that they wanted to abolish the Civil Rights Act. So that was so overtly racist, just to even say that out loud. And I think they put it in some, this was like a state party convention. I have it here in June of 22. And but I think there was in the end not a resolution. It was just some of the delegates who were calling for that. But are you seeing this kind of very overtly trying to actually abolish Black Americans' rights, or was that just an outlier? It made good headlines, obviously, because it was so extreme. But is that just one example, or is it more like this is something that's actually a big thing?
I mean, the state party sets out these planks of their priorities that I think tend to be pretty shocking. And I mean, and certainly people suggest other ideas that are even further extreme than that. And that is generally sort of a list of like where the party would like to go, which is certainly important information about what comes next for Texas. I think the big threat right now is to voting rights. And, Texas has made it very clear that they, along with other conservative states, intend to sort of be on the front lines of trying to root out what they would call voter fraud. And, but broadly speaking, it's just like trying to limit people from voting. Now, some of that is, there are significant limitations that federal courts have still upheld of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. We've not seen the same chipping away at that from the federal courts that we have from some other things, to the same extreme example of, for example, overturning the Roe v. Wade decision. So the Voting Rights Act has remained, to some extent, still intact, but it is certainly sort of the next target, and an ongoing target, and has been a target for conservatives in Texas and other states. And that ultimately is sort of the root of all of this, right? Is who can vote, who has a right to cast a vote, and so who gets a say in who's making all these laws and all of that. So that is certainly the big issue right now in Texas, or one of the big issues in Texas.
Well, I think we're now basically out of time. There's more thank yous in the chat, but I'm not seeing any more questions. So I think it is time to officially close this webinar. Thank you very much to Eleanor and Leo.
Thank you.
Thank you.